CEO offered her employee a deal. Pretend to be my wife at the gala. He never expected her to cry. Before we begin the story, don't forget to subscribe and follow Tender Bonds. Like and share our story. The crescent wrench had been on his workbench since October, and in November Silas had tried to use it. He'd needed to tighten the bolt on the cold water shutoff below the kitchen sink. A half-turn job, 2 minutes, and when he'd picked up the wrench, the jaw was so fused with old grease that the adjustment wheel wouldn't move. He'd stood over the sink with the rusted tool in one hand and a drip tick-ticking onto the cabinet floor, and he'd set the wrench down and gotten the other one, the newer one, and done the job. He put Miller's wrench back where he'd found it. He didn't clean it. He didn't throw it away. That was the shape of his grief, useless things left in place. By January, the wrench had migrated to 3 different corners of the workbench on its own, or so it seemed, the way objects shift in a house when no one is looking. It sat in the cold of the unheated garage, and Silas passed it every morning on his way to the truck, and most mornings didn't see it at all, which was its own kind of thing. The drive to Haverson and Associates took 20 minutes on a good day. In the worst weeks of that January, with Route 9 glazed to a pale gray mirror and the salt trucks coming through at their own indifferent schedule, it took 40. Silas didn't mind. He drove slowly and watched the flat white fields unreal on either side of the highway with the radio off and his hands low on the wheel, and tried not to notice that the silence in the cab of his truck was a different quality of silence than it had been 4 months ago, denser, as if it had a specific weight now, instead of just being the absence of sound. He was thinking about Cass Haverson, which was its own new problem, separate from the grief, grown up alongside it like a second tree from the same root. Asterisk. She was in the parking lot when he pulled in, which was unusual enough that he noticed it. She stood beside her black Silverado with her coat open to the 11-degree morning, as if daring it to try something, reading something on her phone, and she looked up when his headlights crossed her. Cass Haverson was 41. She had dark hair cut short on the sides and grown out on top, not stylish exactly but decided, like everything she did. She ran a mid-sized engineering consulting firm in Findlay, Ohio, which she had inherited from her father, and then tripled in revenue through a particular combination of technical precision and the willingness to make phone calls that other people found uncomfortable. She had been divorced for a year and a half, though only people in the office who dealt with her tax filings, Silas being one, knew the full timeline, the way the departure had preceded the paperwork by 14 months in the way of men who leave gradually, in installments. "Silas," she said when he got close enough. "Ms. Haverson, I need to ask you something that may be strange." He waited, cold worked through his collar. "The Meridian Gala is Saturday. You know about it." He did. The Meridian Group contract was $180,000 of annual work, and the principals were 3 brothers from Sandusky old enough to have opinions they'd never state directly about a woman running a company alone. "Daniel's not coming. He's been not coming to things for a while. But they think," she stopped and looked at the field that ran behind the parking lot, a fallow soybean field stripped to gray stalks, running to a bare tree line. "I need someone to stand next to me and not say anything stupid." "That's a narrow field," Silas said. She looked back at him. "You're the least stupid person in the office." "That's a low bar." "It clears you." She wasn't quite smiling. "There'd be a bonus, 2,000. "I don't need $2,000, Miss Haverson." "No," she said, slowly reading him. "I don't imagine you do." She waited, which was something she was very good at, not filling silence, not softening the ask, just leaving it there for him to deal with on his own terms. He thought, not for the last time, of Miller, specifically of Miller saying, on a Tuesday night in March about 2 years back, with a beer going warm in his hand, "You need to get out of that house before the house decides you're structural and stops noticing you're in it. Miller had a way of delivering the needle and the thread in the same sentence. Silas had laughed at the time. He hadn't taken it seriously at the time. "All right," Silas said. She gave one nod, a fact acknowledged. "Saturday at 7, don't wear the gray blazer." She went inside. He stood another moment in the cold, which felt, he noticed, slightly different than it had 60 seconds ago. Not warmer, just altered. The way a room changes when someone leaves it, though she was the one who had gone in. Asterisk. He should say here to himself, which was the only one who needed the information, that he had not been fine since September. He had believed, for the first 2 months, that he was. He'd gone to work. He'd slept adequately. He'd attended the funeral and helped Joni Trace with the estate paperwork because that was a thing he knew how to do, and doing it had felt useful in a way that he'd mistaken for processing. But Miller Trace had been his closest friend since the 7th grade, which was 32 years of a particular kind of company, the kind you stop hearing because it's always there. They'd grown up together in Findlay, two fatherless boys who'd worked out between them a language of minimum words and understood shorthand. And after Silas's years of leaving and coming back and leaving and coming back for good, they'd occupied each other's lives the way old furniture occupies a room. Not decorative. Load-bearing. Tuesday nights. Whatever game was on, Miller coming in without knocking, going directly to the refrigerator, saying "You're out of beer again, Silas. What is wrong with you?" as a form of greeting. Miller arriving with a bag of groceries on the week Silas's face had a particular flatness to it, without comment, setting them on the counter, opening 2 beers, sitting down. Miller's crescent wrench appearing in Silas's garage one afternoon after Miller had fixed the shut-off valve on the outside spigot. Left behind, as he was always leaving tools behind, as if he was planning to come back. A stroke at 53. September at the refinery, gone before the ambulance. Joni had said it quickly twice as if speed was a mercy. He was gone before they got there. He didn't know. It was that fast. Silas had held this. He was good at holding things without showing he was holding them. In November, when the fields went gray, and the silver maple in his driveway dropped its last leaves, and the house found its winter acoustics, he tried for the first time since the funeral to fix something, that dripping shut-off valve, half a turn, 2 minutes, and he'd reached for Miller's wrench and found it frozen with disuse. The jaw gunked solid, and he'd stood there with the useless thing in his hand and understood, in the way bodies understand things before minds do, that he had been waiting for Miller to come fix it. He'd been waiting for 4 months. Miller had been the one who knew how things worked. Miller had been the one who showed up. Silas had put the wrench down and used the other one and gone back inside and eaten dinner alone and not spoken to anyone that evening, which was not unusual. He'd gotten very good at not unusual. Asterisk. He wore the navy blazer. He drove to the Sandusky Bay Club, a building that had been trying to seem permanent since 1987, and he sat in the parking lot long enough for the engine to tick down to cool. He didn't know precisely what he was doing here. He'd told himself it was a professional favor. He was aware this was partially untrue in ways he wasn't prepared to examine in a parking lot in a navy blazer. Cass was already at the bar when he came in, and she was wearing a dark green dress and holding a glass of water, and standing with the specific controlled stillness of someone who is aware of every person in the room and wants none of them to know it. She saw him cross the floor and something released in her posture, a fraction of the heldness going out, and he noted it the way you note a temperature change, not through thought but through skin. "You're on time," she said. "You said 7. Daniel was never on time. She handed him her water glass. He took it. "The Merritt brothers are at 9 o'clock. Tom Jr. will ask about your golf game." "I don't play golf." "Nobody does. That's the point." She straightened his lapel, a small, precise adjustment, fingers there and gone, and then she took his arm and they crossed the room together, and Silas kept his face neutral and thought of the fields on Route 9, the white flat sameness of them, the trick of distance that made everything equal. The evening ran its groove. Long table, salmon that tasted like effort, 2 glasses of wine that Silas made last 3 hours. Cass beside him the whole time, her shoulder occasionally against his, the warmth of it through his sleeve carrying more information than he wanted to process. She spoke to the Merritt brothers with a particular kind of authority, not aggressive, not deferential, something more like a fixed point that they had to organize themselves around. He watched her do it and understood, not for the first time, that she was very good at her work, and that being very good at her work had cost her something he couldn't yet name. She leaned close once to say, in the low, specific register meant only for him, "Gordon Merritt is about to bring up the Lakewood project. Just agree it was complicated." And then later, after the dessert no one wanted, her voice still low but different now, the performance layer slightly down. "You're doing well. Thank you." He hadn't known he needed to hear that. He kept that knowledge at the edge of his attention where it couldn't do anything. Late in the evening, a couple at the next table, older, comfortable with each other in the way of people who have run out of performance, said something ordinary, asking how long they'd been together. Cass said, easily, "We worked together, it's been years." The woman said, "You can always tell with some couples," and she was looking at both of them, and Silas felt Cass go still beside him. Not the controlled stillness of earlier, the other kind. The kind that comes from being caught by something you didn't know was coming. He reached across and put his hand over hers on the tablecloth. He didn't look at her. He just put his hand there and kept it there until he felt the tension go out of her fingers by small degrees, like a fist opening, and he still didn't look at her, and she didn't move her hand away. In the parking lot afterward, in the cold that had softened slightly, a January thaw working its way up from the south, the weather radio had said, temperatures climbing toward the 30s by morning. She stopped next to his truck and didn't say anything for a long moment. Her breath made small clouds in the orange wash of the lot lights. He waited with his hands in his pockets. "Thank you," she said finally. "You'll get the contract." "That's not," she stopped. She looked at him and her eyes were very bright, and she was holding something close to the surface that she clearly hadn't meant to have close to the surface. "When someone just touched my hand," she said carefully, "I wasn't ready for it. I've gotten very used to being in a room full of people and being," she stopped again, almost laughed, which was worse than crying. "I'm sorry, that's a lot for a parking lot." "It's fine," Silas said. He looked at his truck and then back at her. "There's a diner on Route 9 that I have no reasonable defense for. Bad coffee, but they leave you alone." She was deciding something. He could see the mechanism of it, the small visible gear work behind her eyes. Then, "Okay." Asterisk. Deb's diner had not changed since 1994 and did not plan to. The coffee arrived in heavy mugs with a nick on the rim of Silas's usual one, and the booths held the vinyl smell of decades of ordinary hours, and they sat across from each other at 11:15 on a Saturday night with no one else in the place except Deb herself, who had once removed a man by his collar for a comment about her daughter's life choices and did not appear to have softened on the subject. They talked. Silas told her about Findlay, about coming up without a father, about his mother who'd been sharp and funny and died at 58 from something that moved fast. Cass told him about Cleveland, 3 brothers, a mother who expressed love through cooking and a father who expressed it through fixing things. "Every time he repaired something in the house," she said, "it meant he was glad you were there. He fixed the garage door the week I came home from a bad relationship, and I stood in the driveway and cried for 20 minutes, and he had absolutely no idea why." "That's a dialect," Silas said. "Exactly. I didn't learn to speak it until it was too late." She turned her mug in her hands. "Daniel spoke a different dialect, very fluent, very easy to hear. I mistook fluency for depth for a long time." He thought of Miller, the particular language of a man who never asked how you were doing but showed up on Thursdays when you hadn't called him, with a six-pack and no explanation, because he'd learned to read the frequency of your texts the way a doctor reads a pulse. "I lost my best friend in September," Silas said. This was the first time he'd said those words to anyone outside the funeral. They came out flat and factual, as he'd intended, but landed differently than he'd intended. Cass went still in the listening way, the kind that doesn't push or prompt, just stays. 32 years, he said. We talked without talking. He came over without being asked. He stopped. He looked at the nick on the rim of his mug. I keep trying to fix things in the house and reaching for his wrench, and it's gunked up with his grease and it won't. I can't get the jaw to move. He heard how this sounded. That's not a metaphor. It's actually a wrench. I know, she said. It's also a metaphor. She reached across and put her hand on the back of his. He looked at it. Then he turned his hand over and they sat like that, the bad coffee going cold between them, while Deb refilled the mugs without asking, and the highway outside ran empty and wet in the false thaw. And Silas Crane thought about how terrible and simple it was, to be known by someone who wasn't even trying to know you, who was just sitting there, across a table, being present in the specific irreplaceable way that no amount of solitude could replicate. He thought Miller knew this. Miller knew this about me the whole time. He did not say it. He just held her hand in the diner at midnight, in Ohio, in January, in the brief false warmth before the cold came back. Asterisk. They were careful with each other after that. There are ways of being careful that are also ways of being afraid, and Silas understood this about both of them without naming it, the way he understood most true things, through evidence, not declaration. She started leaving the light on in her office when the others left, which meant the light was still on when he was finishing the quarterly filings, and he could see it under her door the way you notice a porch light even when you're not looking for it. He started leaving a full coffee thermos on the kitchen counter in the morning instead of just the cup he needed, so there was something for whoever came in first. Neither of them mentioned either thing. They passed each other in the hallway and said the ordinary things, but the ordinary things had a different weight now, a density, the way a word you've heard in a particular voice never quite recovers its previous neutrality. Silas drove to work on Route 9 and watched the fields go gray, then white, then gray again, as the January thaw retreated back into hard cold, as they always do, the thaw being a rumor Ohio tells itself each year before recanting. The thermometer on his garage door frame read 8 degrees on the Wednesday morning 2 weeks after the diner, and that Wednesday afternoon he tried again with Miller's wrench. He needed to snug the compression fitting on the garden hose bib, which had been weeping since November. He picked up the crescent wrench and worked the adjustment wheel, and it moved, barely, grudgingly, with the resistance of something that hasn't been asked to function in a long time, but it moved. He got it open 3/4 of an inch, just enough for the fitting's bolt, and he made the job and put the wrench back and stood in the cold garage for a moment with the smell of old grease on his fingers. Progress maybe, or just use. He didn't know the difference anymore. Asterisk. The pipe burst on a Tuesday night in late January. This was not, in retrospect, surprising. The supply elbow on the main line had been going to green for years. Miller had told him so. Get that swapped out before a hard winter, Silas. You've got electrolytic corrosion on that fitting and it won't last. And Silas had meant to get around to it. Had in fact written it on a list, but lists without Miller to ask him about them had a way of disappearing into drawers. He was reading in the kitchen when he heard the hiss. Not a bang. A sustained pressurized hiss from inside the wall adjacent to the utility room, the kind of sound a house makes just before it stops being quiet about something. He got the flashlight from the drawer under the sink and went to the basement, and what he found was the elbow joint on the main supply line. The copper gone fully to green and split along 4 inches of its length, and the water coming off it in a flat, hard sheet that hit the concrete floor and spread in all directions and was, already, above the top of his shoes. He went for the main shutoff. His hand found the handle and he muscled it closed. It was stiff, hadn't been turned in years, and the sheet of water became a drip and then stopped. He stood ankle-deep in the spreading pool on the concrete floor and took inventory of what he knew. He knew the main was off. He knew the repair required copper fittings and a torch or CPVC and primer, and he had none of these things and no capacity to do the work even if he had, because this was not the half-turn shut-off job. This was the other kind. The kind Miller had done twice on Blanchard Street and called him from each time to say, "Not hard, just annoying. I'll show you sometime." He pulled out his phone. His thumb went to Miller's name before he decided anything, found it in muscle memory, the way you reach for a light switch in a room that's been dark for months. And he pressed call and raised the phone to his ear and stood in the wet basement with the cold of the water coming up through his shoes while Miller's phone rang once, twice, 3 times, 4. And then the recorded voice came on, the actual voice, unhurried and faintly amused the way it always was. "This is Miller. Leave a number." The water was still moving, slow now, finding the drain that was not draining. The shop light buzzed. Silas stood with the phone to his ear and Miller's voice in it and the water cold around his ankles, and he didn't move. He let the beep happen. He didn't speak. He ended the call and stood there for one more moment that lasted a long time, and the thing that broke the moment was not a decision but a shiver. His body stating its conditions plainly, outside of whatever his mind was doing, and he found Cass's name and called it. Second ring. "Hey," she said. 10:20 at night, no hesitation, no sleep in her voice. "Pipe's gone," he said. "Main supply line. I've killed the water, but he stopped. I called Miller first, out of reflex. He didn't pick up." He heard himself say this and felt the specific exposure of having said it, the way you feel air on a place that's always been covered. A pause, not a long one. "Where's the split?" "Supply elbow basement." "Copper or CPVC?" "Copper, green as a—" He stopped. "Bad." "I know a plumber," she said. "Are you all right?" The question went past the pipe, and they both knew it, and he said, "Not especially." "I'll come, don't touch anything else." The line ended. He climbed the basement stairs and went to the kitchen and stood at the counter. The house was very quiet with the water off, a different quiet than usual, something missing from its ambient sound, the way a refrigerator silence is a noise. He was wet from mid-shin down, and he was cold, and he did not go change his shoes. He stood at the counter and waited, and did not examine why it felt important to be still until she got there. Asterisk. She was there in 20 minutes. Jeans, work coat, mud-tested boots. She didn't knock, doors open, he'd said on the phone, and her steps crossed the kitchen and found the basement stairs, and then she was down there with him in the pool and the buzzing light. And she looked at the split pipe with a flashlight she'd brought from her own truck. And then she looked at him. And she didn't comment on his wet feet or his face, whatever his face was doing. She called the plumber. His name was Trace, which is a first name in that part of Ohio. She spoke to him in the shorthand of people who have done business for a long time, and the call was 90 seconds. "He's 40 minutes, she said. "Okay." "Come upstairs," she said. He made tea she hadn't asked for. They sat at the kitchen table with it between them, and the January thaw had arrived. Finally, genuinely, the temperature up to 36 outside. The snow on the roof dripping in a thin line past the window like a clock nobody wound. He didn't know if he'd registered the thaw before tonight. He'd been driving through it for 3 days without it meaning anything. She told him about her mother's reading glasses, which had been in the console of her car since September of the previous year, when they'd sold the house. "I can't move them," she said. "I've tried. I pick them up and then I put them back, and then I forget I was going to move them until the next time I see them. It's been 9 months. "Yes," Silas said. "I know exactly what you mean about the wrench." "The jaw won't move," he said. "I tried again this week. It moved a little." She looked at him. "That's something." "Maybe," he said. She put her hand on the table between them, palm up. Not reaching for him, just placing it there, available. He looked at it for a moment that was long enough to mean something, and then he put his hand in it, and they sat like that with the tea and the dripping roof and the 40 minutes of Trace making his way through the warming night toward them, and Silas thought, here is what Miller was doing all those years. Not coming over because Silas needed him. coming over because Silas would never ask. Because asking was the thing Silas had never learned, and Miller had known this and shown up anyway reliably for 32 years, until the Tuesday he couldn't. Cass didn't say it'll be okay or I'm so sorry or anything that would have required him to deflect it. She just sat there, present and warm, the same way a porch light is present, not insisting, just on. He held her hand in his wet-chewed kitchen and understood, for the first time with his full understanding and not just the edge of it, that his aloneness had never been a preference. It had been a failure of nerve that he had narrated to himself as self-sufficiency for 44 years, and Miller had known it, and Miller had refused to let it stand, and Miller was gone. What you owed the dead was to let the living in. He didn't say that. Neither of them said anything. Trace arrived and fixed the pipe in an hour and 20 minutes with the deliberate economy of a man who had seen worse on worse nights, and when the water came back on Silas turned every faucet in the house once, just to hear it moving. Asterisk. She stayed until 2 in the morning, when the house had warmed back up and the tea had become a second round of tea, and then a glass of water each. The conversation moving the way conversations move when people have stopped performing for each other and are simply talking. She told him about her father's last year, the way illness had stripped him back to the dialect. Every repaired thing in those final months, a declaration he had no other language for. She told him about learning to run the company, which was partly grief and partly discovery, the way she'd found inside the work a competence she hadn't known she owned. He told her things he had not told anyone, about the years of leaving Findlay and coming back, about the shape of his particular loneliness, which he had spent a long time mistaking for independence, and which Miller had spent a long time gently, stubbornly, refusing to confirm. He sounds like someone who loved you in a language you could actually receive, she said. Silas sat with that. Yes, he said finally, that's right. At the door, she pulled her coat on and worked the zipper, and he watched her hands on the pull, the small, familiar motion, and he crossed the kitchen. He took the zipper pull from her fingers and drew it the rest of the way, and then he didn't step back. She looked up at him in the kitchen light, her face plain and open in a way it hadn't been in the office or at the gala, the assessment layer all the way down, and he put his hand against her jaw, and she turned into it slightly, the way you lean toward a door you've been standing outside of for longer than was reasonable. He kissed her. She kissed him back without hesitation and without theater, the way people kiss when they're past the performance of it. It was a kitchen at 2 a.m. kiss, a burst pipe and bad tea kiss, and when they separated she put her forehead briefly against his and they stood like that for a moment in the warm house with the water moving in the repaired walls. I have to go, she said. I know. She left. He stood in the kitchen and listened to her truck start in the driveway and listened to the specific diminishing sound of it turning onto Ewing Road, and then it was quiet. But it was a different quiet, the kind that has something in it. In February, he cleaned the wrench. He did it on a Saturday morning when the thermometer had crept above freezing for the first time since the thaw, the world outside going from white to gray to a wet, provisional brown that was not quite hope, but was at least the memory of a different season. He took the wrench to the workbench and opened a tin of mineral spirits and spent 20 minutes with a rag, working the grease from the jaw and the rust from the adjustment wheel, working carefully, the way you work when you're not trying to erase something but to see it clearly. The wrench was old. The jaw had wear in it, and one tooth of the serration was chipped, and the handle had been rewrapped once with black electrical tape that had since dried and cracked at the edges. He cleaned all of it. He left all of it. He oiled the adjustment wheel until it moved freely, and he set the jaw to the size of the supply elbow fitting below the kitchen sink. The one Miller had fixed that first time, 7 years ago, the time he'd left the wrench behind, and he confirmed it seated correctly. Then he hung it on a nail above the workbench, between his own hammer and the level with the slightly false bubble, where he would see it every morning on his way to the truck. He stood back and looked at it. It was not new. It was not gone. It was just where it was supposed to be, doing what it was supposed to do, available for the next time something needed fixing. On a Saturday in early March, the first Saturday the temperature came up through 40 and kept going, Silas stood at his kitchen window with his coffee and watched Cass's black Silverado come up the driveway and stop. She didn't come to the door. She didn't knock. She sat with the engine running and her window down an inch, her hand resting on the outside of the door in the cool morning air, and from the kitchen he could see the shape of her at the wheel, the short dark hair, the angle of her jaw, the particular quality of her stillness, which he had learned to read now the same way he'd learned to read the difference between Miller's silence and Miller's quiet, the way you learn any dialect, by staying close enough, long enough, to hear the difference. He didn't move away from the window. He lifted his mug and let the coffee warm his lip and watched her idle there in the driveway while the silver maple above the truck showed, along its highest branches, the first reddened swellings of the coming year, barely there, invisible unless you knew what you were looking for, which he did. He stood in the window. He watched the engine smoke thin into the warming air. Outside, she didn't leave.